focused on empowering people and institutions to work together to build just and fair societies. In Latin America, Illuminate supports courageous organizations and leaders defending democracy, promoting civic engagement, protecting digital rights, and expanding press freedom. And we're fortunate to be joined by a number of those leaders today. Notwithstanding the title of today's event, which refers to the post-pandemic period, we are, of course, very aware that the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over. It continues to have devastating effects on lives and on livelihoods across the world, but perhaps especially in Latin America. We have also been attuned from the early days of the pandemic to the second-order consequences, especially in the area of democratic governance. So now that the first coronavirus vaccines have begun to emerge, and it's possible to at least start imagining life after the pandemic, we thought it was a good moment to take stock of how democracy has fared under the enormous economic and social strain of the pandemic, and what democracy might look like at the conclusion of this very painful period. The answer, of course, will be shaped not only by the fallout of the pandemic itself, but by a number of forces that were already evident prior to 2020. These include political polarization and fragmentation, endemic corruption, rising populism, and deliberate online disinformation, forces that certainly manifested themselves very clearly in the elections and social protests we saw in Latin America in 2018 and 2019. So there is clearly a lot to reflect on, to sort through in terms of where we are and where we may be going. And fortunately, we are joined by really a stellar panel of experts from across the hemisphere. Their full and very impressive bios are online. So I will simply deliver brief introductions here so that we can jump into the conversation. Arturo Valenzuela is Emeritus Professor of Government and International Relations at Georgetown University, where he founded and led for many years the Center for Latin American Studies. He is also, of course, a former senior diplomat, was the Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Obama administration, as well as having senior posts in the Clinton administration as well. Ilona Szabo is the co-founder and president of Igarapé Institute, a Brazilian think tank and close partner of the dialogue. Her new book is titled The Defense of Civil Space. Felipe Estefan is the Latin America director and head of the DC office of Illuminate. He previously worked for the World Bank, the Open Contracting Partnership, and the Colombian mission to the United Nations in Geneva. And last but not least, Laura Sommer is executive director and editor-in-chief of Chequeado, Latin America's first fact-checking organization. She's also a professor at the University of Buenos Aires and formerly worked for the think tank CIPEC and for the Argentine Ministry of Justice. Welcome again to all of you. Really a delight to have you with us. Before we get started, just a few logistical notes. You can follow this event on Twitter at #DemocracyLatAm, @The Dialogue, and @Luminate Group. We invite participants to submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, the event hashtag on Twitter, or to email questions to meetings@thedialogue.org. A reminder also that we will be holding this discussion in English, but we do have simultaneous translation to Spanish for those joining us through Zoom. So aprovechen, por favor, la traducción al español para quienes lo precisen. With that, we are going to jump straight into the conversation here. I'll moderate the first portion of this, and we will use the last half hour or so to turn to questions we receive from the audience. So with that, Arturo Valenzuela, let me start with you. You are, of course, a longtime observer of democratic trends in Latin America. The latest data from Latino Barometro, which is from 2018, shows support for democracy at just 48% in the region, the lowest in almost 20 years. And that was before the social protests last year and obviously the pandemic this year, which has led some governments in the region to actually concentrate executive power. And we've seen some emerging trends that are troublesome in some countries. On the other hand, most democratic systems are holding, and they're holding under really enormous strain from the economic crisis and social pressures that are a byproduct of the pandemic. So to kick us off, can you give us kind of your assessment of the current state of democracy in Latin America and how you think we will emerge from the pandemic on that score?
Well, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be with you and to join this discussion. Let me just add one thing to my bio. I'm also a proud member of the Luminate International Advisory Group board. So I've been pulled into to the Luminate world, and I very much appreciate what Luminate is doing in its work all across the world, but particularly in Latin America in our case. Let me just start out by saying that let's put things in the broader context, and you sort of did very quickly, Michael. This is the longest period of constitutional rule in the entire history of Latin America, which goes way back. Remember, these are the oldest nation states really in the world, independent nation states in the world, practically. When the UN was founded in San Francisco in 1945, the Latin American states were half of the members that founded the United Nations. The same thing with Bretton Woods. If you go to Bretton Woods, it's Nicaragua and all kinds of Latin American nations, because most of the world was of course still in the throes of huge empires. So this is the longest period of so at the same time, this is also the continent where there's been the longest trajectory of representative democracy, copying, after the failure of the French Revolution, the American constitutional framework. So this is the longest. Now, the Cold War ended. Things didn't go very well in Latin America with all this. Neither did they in the United States, by the way. Civil War, all that kind of stuff. But 42% of all changes of government in Latin America from the 1930s to the 1980s were by military coup. Only 3 countries avoided the huge bureaucratic authoritarian period from the 1960s to the 1980s. And yet in this last period, there have only been 3 classic military coups. So let's put that in context that in some ways we're still seeing the longest period of constitutional governance. Let me say another thing about Latin America. It's the one continent in the world that does not experience or will not experience irredentist politics. Irredenta, as the Italians called it, which of course is subalternate loyalties being more important than the loyalties to the larger community. With some exceptions, where Ilona is in Canada, perhaps you have a little bit of that. And I don't want to put the Caribbean in here because we're not talking really about what's going on in Guyana and other places like that, where you do have some of these irredentists. But when the Zapatista uprising took place in Mexico and Subcomandante Marcos came up on the 1st of January of 1994, it wasn't to create a Mayan republic. So these are countries that are fairly, in that sense, not even Europe, of course, can say that because of the importance of these subalternate loyalties. So then thirdly, there's been a tremendous progress since the end of the Cold War also in the fight against absolute poverty. Absolute poverty has declined from about 50% to about 10% in most countries in Latin America. Not the levels of inequality, just absolute poverty. So that's another thing to say there. And of course, we don't know where the pandemic is going to take us because we're really in a huge economic crisis going forward as well. But as you also pointed out, there are challenges to democracy right now, even though only maybe 3 military coups, classic, 2 in Haiti, by the way, and 1 in Ecuador, 21 presidents have not been able to finish their terms of office, Vizcarra being the last one. So there is a crisis of democratic governance. And the wonderful data that Luminate has brought to us, underscores that sort of thing. And let me just very quickly say that what we've got in Latin America is a crisis of what you might call the rule of law that needs to be addressed, which is and I'm not referring only to corruption. I'm referring to the fact that like in the United States recently, some people are saying elections don't count, or we can do anything with the Supreme Court or whatever. We'll just put our people in, and so on and so forth. So there's a crisis of the rule of law. But secondly, there's a serious crisis of what you call the system of democratic representation. Democracy is in crisis in Latin America because what is the government of the people, for the people, by the people. It's a government of representative government, has to be called. Direct democracy is dangerous. And here I want to put that down right away. What is direct democracy? Plebiscites, direct appeals to whom? The savior. If people are unhappy with representative democracy, if parliaments are out of fashion or they're viewed as corrupt, as people don't like political parties anymore, and all those things have come down. So there is a reversal in a sense of some of the better prospects that we saw with the end of the Cold War. Now, with this crisis of what I called the representation. And because of the crisis of representation, you get the crisis of the rule of governance in Latin America. These presidents that can continue. And the danger, of course, is unbridled populism of either right or left, where you get a savior that people look to. And what saviors do, of course, is they, instead of strengthening institutions of representative government, destroy institutions of representative governments. So I think that that's kind of a quick view. What do we need to do? What do we need to do? We need to strengthen representative government. We cannot just sort of think, oh, well, what we need to do is have more plebiscites, like what Andrés Manuel López Obrador likes to do in Mexico, because, again, direct democracy of that kind is something that it just simply doesn't work. You can only do sort of direct democracy if you have small city states where everybody can get together in one venue and vote in that venue. But if you're going to have if you have large nation states, then you have to have really a system of representation, which means stronger legislatures, a better relationships between legislatures and presidents. And there's a real crisis in there in that sense. Let me just finish by pointing to one element that I think is absolutely crucial in understanding what's happening. And I've written a lot about this, what's happening with the 21 presidencies that failed, where people had to leave. They just couldn't stay in office, and so on and so forth. Is in Latin America, we also have, and this is something that presidentialism is bound to fall into, and that is because there are two sorts of legitimacies. There's the legitimacy of the presidency, the popular legitimacy of the presidency, and the popular legitimacy of the legislature. And in this popular legitimacy, the problem in Latin America has been presidencies of double minorities, presidents that don't have minorities, and don't have majorities in the legislature. So they're the safety valves to be able to get around that are things. So there are lots of, like in the United States, we have to think about how we reform the electoral college and the redistricting system and a whole host of things like that. In Latin America as well, we have to sort of think more about what needs to be done to avoid a system of what I call double minority presidencies. Parliamentary forms of government don't have that problem. In fact, 40% of all parliamentary governments in Europe, in a sample of 165 governments, were minority governments, but they were able to govern on the principle of the majority rule because the majority did not necessarily want to, go to a new election. So anyway, those are the kinds of institutional things that we need to sort of think about. And then finally, look, if you have massive periods of inequality, I talked about how extreme poverty has gone way down. But what is the problem that we face right now? Precisely because extreme poverty has gone way down, that doesn't necessarily mean that if the inequality remains so high, that there aren't a whole host of people that are extremely frustrated because they have, rising expectations that have been unfulfilled, and with the crisis of the coronavirus and the pandemic and so on and so forth, it's going to get much worse. So that's a further challenge that explains some of the data that Luminate has come up with and others of people who just don't care anymore. I don't think that there isn't an applause for democracy, but there isn't necessarily a resounding sort of endorsement of the institutions that people perceive now for democracy.
Great, thanks, Arturo. That's terrific. I think really sets us up well for the rest of this conversation, and we will turn to the data you mentioned from Luminate, which will help to guide our discussion. But first, I want to just bring Ilona into the conversation. because a number of the broad trends, Arturo, that you mentioned in terms of unbridled populism, the need to strengthen representative government, sense of unfulfilled expectations, and even leaders that present themselves as saviors of the people. These are obviously things that I think in the case of Brazil are quite clear when we think about recent events. Ilona, I'd love your reflections on the case of Brazil, specifically within the framework that Arturo described. I think there's a pessimistic view, obviously, that looks at corruption, populism, division, democratic backsliding under President Bolsonaro, and is concerned, frankly, for the future of Brazilian democracy. And there's a more optimistic view, which looks at the resilience of the separation of powers, the role of Congress and the courts, but also of the press, of civil society groups like your own, and their ability to construct some guardrails around a very, shall we say, autocratic president. Where do you land in terms of the glass half full, glass half empty of Brazilian democracy?
So thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the Inter-American Dialogue and Luminet for this invitation. It's a very, very urgent and I think important debate. I mean, there are so many issues to unpack in Arturo's introductory remarks. I think we have to go back to many, but I'll stick to the first ones that link to your question. I think it's important to understand that Brazil is a young democracy. I mean, our last period of dictatorship, that was a 20-year period, ended in the mid 80s. And since then, I've been working, and I think the whole institutional framework was really strengthened. And we have to just say, we were working our way. But also in the point of rule of law, there were many, many gaps that were still to be addressed, linked also to inequalities, linked to the kind of people that we have. I mean, in Brazil, there is still, unfortunately, a legacy from, for example, slavery that we can't face, not to say the legacy also of dictatorship that we can't really face in a mature discussion society. These are issues that still raise a lot of questions, and as if they were different interpretation of what happened in history. Dare to say, we deal with populist leaders since many years, so this is not the first time. What changed now is that we're dealing with a populist authoritarian leader that has a very clear agenda since before, since he was a congressman and also during his campaign. So all the, I'll say, the intentions that he had in terms of undermining the checks and balances, the separation of power, the space for debate in the country, all this was very clear since much before the election. There was nothing there. So I think a big question is to say why Brazilians went in this direction. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, also linked to what Arturo says. But that said, I do think now we are in honestly a crossroads in the country. Because so I'm an optimistic person by nature, but there are many conditions that have to be met for us to avoid a protracted period of, let's say, illiberal democracy in the sense that we're seeing in other countries, including in Europe. If you think about countries that are led by profiles like President Bolsonaro ones. So I think there are a few conditions. In the beginning of the year, we had this, I would say, heated moment where there was even, again, an impeachment discussion because the President Bolsonaro was attacking the Supreme Court, attacking Congress. And that was, how can I say, a moment where we thought, okay, either institutions will react or there will be a rupture here. What happened since then is, because some of the institutions reacted, he had to back a little bit. But that's there to say that institutions are not, I would say, safe. The executive institutions are not at all. So there are lots of, I would say, nominations. There are ministers that are there to do the opposite of their mandates. So when you see the environment cabinet, the foreign relations, human rights, even public security agendas that are very important for Brazil are being led in a very ideological and total, how can I say, detached to the needs and challenges that the country face. Education is another one. So with the COVID crisis, which Brazil unfortunately is, in the top there of like mismanagement, until today, the public schools did not come back in Brazil. And there's a project also to undermine the quality of education, the information students come. So there is clearly an intent to rewrite history also for our students. So this is all happening in like, we're seeing this and we can't do anything because these are institutions from the executive government. And in that sense also, the public servants that are there are being, in a way, either they have to follow the guidance, but if they don't, they're also being censored. So there's a lot of information in terms of impossibility of dialogue, but also non-alignment leading to different kind of, I would say, positions and way out of the table inside the government, not only outside. So this is one thing. The other thing is that the president has been pursuing something that he said since the beginning of his campaign that he would never do, which is this alliances with the most physiological, is a term that we use in Brazil for the parties that are always in power, regardless who is in power, they're there supporting power if they get their, I would say, benefits that are not very republic benefits. So we call the physiological parties. And to sustain his government, and given all the escalation that he had just provoked until the middle of this year, now he has made alliances, I would say, with the oldest style of politics in Brazil that opens the space for all sorts of things that he also said that he would combat: corruption and all the other situations and that we have to face in Brazil. And third, I would say that some institutions that are dealing with the rule of law, criminal justice, public security, there are accusations of infiltration there as well. So there's accusations that are still being investigated of interference, for example, in our federal police. So I would say institutions are partly resisting, but there are many, many attacks in many, many fronts. And when you look at the other lens, which I think we'll have time to discuss here, what I call the civic space, then we're in a different situation. There is no, I would say, the capacity for reaction and for institutional kind of pushback is smaller. So I do believe that there is a moment now that institutions will have to step up, because the traditional political science, I would say, mechanisms and criteria don't capture what is happening inside institutions many times, and cannot have, because of course, what we believe and support, the rule of law and the due process. They don't catch things with the agility to prevent the undermining of the role of these institutions. So I would say we need to protect the people that are trying inside the institutions as well to do their jobs.
Wonderful, thank you, Ilona. That was terrific. We will definitely come back to the issue of civic space. Let me turn now to Felipe. We've mentioned a couple of times, Felipe, the work that you all have been doing to put together some survey data that gives us kind of a snapshot of where we are on some of these questions. You got, I think, 26,000 responses from Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico on citizens' attitudes towards democracy, authoritarianism, COVID response. So maybe you could just walk us through kind of some of the principal findings of that to start, the extent to which they reflect or not some of the conclusions we've heard from Arturo and Ilona, and we could take the conversation from there.
Thank you, Michael. And I think we've added the research to the chat, and hope that everyone who's joining us is able to benefit from that research. We've long been concerned with the state of Latin American democracy at Luminate. Even before the pandemic, it was clear that Latin American democracy was suffering what I refer to as a crisis of trust and a crisis of representation. A crisis of trust because citizens weren't able to really trust that those in power would do right by them and fight for the public interest. Clearly, the cases of corruption that our region has suffered are an example of that. But also a crisis of trust and legitimacy because Latin American democracies have, quite frankly, had mixed results. Latin America continues to be the most unequal region in the world. And for citizens who thought that that democracy would bring with it promises of inclusive development, the fact that those promises haven't become a reality is a source of concern. There's also a crisis of representation because those who are in power don't necessarily represent the interests or the diversity of the communities that they seek to represent. And the institutions are not actually, going to Arturo's point, are not the institutions that are supposed to represent the interest of the people are not functioning in that way. So that was already happening prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But of course, as COVID has hit, we've seen that our region has suffered outsized impact from the pandemic. And it is abundantly clear that that outsized impact of the pandemic comes partly from the mismanagement that political leaders have had of the crisis. And those populist authoritarians that Ilona was referring to are high up on the list of leaders who have mismanaged this crisis, have peddled disinformation, and have ensured that, unfortunately, the impacts of COVID will be long-lasting in our region. And so understanding that the pandemic would have such far-reaching impacts and that Latin American democracy was already facing significant threats prior to the pandemic, we set out to measure how the pandemic was impacting attitudes towards democracy. And as you were saying, Michael, we conducted a survey, 26,000 responses in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Those were collected through 3 waves of measurement, one in May, one in August, and one in October. And the results, unfortunately, confirm some of the trends that we had been seeing. So let me share just 4 key results that I think will be helpful in the context of this conversation. The first is that the favorability of democracy is clearly declining. We've seen that in other surveys, Latino Barometro and others have shown that there's a greater dissatisfaction towards democracy that we had seen in years past. And what I think is most striking about the data that Luminate is releasing today is that the lack of favorability of democracy is greatest amongst young people. So the younger you are in all 4 countries, in all 3 waves, the younger you are, the least likely you are to have a favorable view of democracy. That is incredibly concerning. Our hypothesis at Luminate is that partly is a result of the fact that younger people, when we are saying younger people in Luminate survey, those age 16 to 24 are the ones who shown the least favorable views of democracy. Those people in those age brackets didn't really live through the authoritarian regimes, the military dictatorships that older folks did live through, and have only seen a democracy that has had the kind of mixed results that I was referencing earlier. So they do show a greater propensity to try something different. And I think that is quite dangerous because if youth stops defending and seeing democracy in a favorable manner, that creates grounds for changes in political systems that could be quite concerning. So that's the first result. I think the second big result is that in Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, the leaders of those countries got very poor marks from their citizens on their handling of the pandemic. Argentina saw a huge 30-point swing between May and October, in which in May, 82% felt that the government was handling the pandemic well. In October, only 52% thought the same. And Laura perhaps may want to comment a bit more on that. And as those 3 presidents saw their markings on their handling of the pandemic go down, that also impacted their popularity. In all 3 countries, our survey suggests that if those presidents were up for re-election, they would not actually be re-elected. That's a hypothetical scenario because in Colombia, of course, the president can't run for re-election. The one exception there in the survey is Brazil, where President Bolsonaro actually saw his popularity increase from the first measurement to the last one. Our hypothesis is that that comes partly through the result of that direct cash transfer program that the Brazilian government implemented, partly at the urging of many in civil society. Ilona can comment more on this, but that program cannot last for that much longer, and the results of the elections, the subnational elections in Brazil on Sunday, suggest that that spike in Bolsonaro's popularity perhaps will now come down. But that's kind of the second big result. A third one is that there's a very low trust in sources of information. In Colombia, a quarter of the people surveyed say that they don't trust any source of information at all. Not scientists, not journalists, not politicians, not doctors. 20% said the same in Brazil, 20% said the same in Mexico. That is very concerning in the middle of a public health crisis that requires people to trust sources of information. But it's not a surprise because many of the populist authoritarian leaders that are ruling in Latin America have taken it on to delegitimize sources of information, have attacked press freedom, and have used social media to spread disinformation. And so we see that that is having a very negative impact on how people think about information. And finally, there is a marked rise in the support of citizens in these four countries for the right to protest against the governments, the sitting governments. In Colombia and Argentina, we saw almost 10 points of increase from May to October on the number of citizens who said that they would support protests against the sitting governments. In Mexico and in Brazil, that number remains over the 50% mark. So now in all four countries, the majority of the people support protesting against the government and are no longer hindered by the health risks that protesting in the middle of the pandemic would bring along. In the earlier measurements, people were concerned that taking to the streets would of course pose a risk to their health. But now as those risks are understood further and as people become more comfortable with the current situation, we're seeing in places from Colombia to Chile, people continuing to protest on causes that are important to them. And I think that is worth noting. So I'll pause there to allow for more exchanges, but I do think that there are signs for concern here, but that Arturo was saying, another very important message is that there's people all across Latin America, Ilona, Laura, and many others who are fighting to keep the spirit of democracy alive, and that it'll be very important for those of us in the international community and for the Biden administration to stand by them as they continue to do that.
Great, thank you, Felipe. That's terrific, really thought-provoking, and I think again we'll come back to a lot of the issues that you raised. Laura, let me raise one of these issues with you, which is, Felipe referred to lack of trust in information, and that's probably a consequence of many things, but online disinformation, the kind of explosion in online disinformation in recent years is almost certainly one factor. We've seen this sort of evolve. I mean, we certainly saw it in the context of the pandemic. I know that's something that you were focused on. We also had a number of elections recently here in the United States, but also in Bolivia, in Chile, and Brazil, the recent local elections. So I wonder if you could just reflect on kind of the information environment broadly, the particular challenge of deliberate disinformation online in particular, and the measures that Chequialo and others are taking to try to address this particular challenge and phenomenon.
Yeah. Hi, everyone, and thank you for this event and this conversation. All the people around the world ask us as fact checkers more or less the same related to if we can say that we have more disinformation today than in the past. And the answer that we always give is that online disinformation seems to be prevalent. Although as fact checkers, we know it is hard to quantify exactly how much disinformation circulates. And I think that's an important point to do, because today we know much more about this type of campaigns and propaganda that we knew in the past. And I'm not saying that disinformation is not a huge problem. What I'm saying is it's not completely new, the problem we are facing. In particular, this year, they can be a hard combination or mix between the infodemic generated by the pandemic, including some leaders that you mentioned that were not at all evidence-based in their press conference, in their policies, etc. And also the electoral disinformation coordinated by different groups, in some cases parties, in some cases followers from some parties, in some cases business groups that support one candidate or the other, that obviously increase the amount of content that is not high quality information. The things that we know and we do is that the work of fact checkers is not enough for this huge stuff or for this huge problem. And there are some perhaps good practices that we implement that I think are useful not only for infodemic or for election, but for any information crisis around the world. And one is to work in alliance and collaborations, like, for example, what we did during the presidential election in Argentina last year, that is called Reverso, that put together technology companies, but also more than 120 media, traditional media, the most important and big media in the country, but also perhaps a radio in a small city with just 2 reporters working together, trying to increase the reach and increase the impact for our work, but also trying to have a voice and to listen what type of content were being viral in ways and in formats and in places that not always the journalists used to be in the past. And I'm talking about WhatsApp in our countries, that is much more important than what is in the US scenario of society. But also in some cases, they were content that started in a chat, and after a while, some online media that they were not necessary media, but they were just spaces where the candidates were making their campaign, make that content much more relevant for that special community. Then what we think is, on one side, we should have better and bigger alliance and collaborations. On the other side, there's a lot of to do in prevent debunking, to alert people of possibility of disinformation and to help people to identify disinformation when they receive it. And that used to be, I can say effective, but relatively effective in some cases during the pandemic in Argentina, when we list a number of issues that we know they were bad content circulating, and we made a kind of alert to the people saying, if you see tomorrow this on your cell phone or a media that is not necessarily a source that you trust on, know or have an alert and don't share that content. Don't contribute to make the problem bigger or worse. And also the other thing that we are super alert to do in the future, in future elections, is to work with other, not only make alliance or partnerships with media or technology companies, but also other people, perhaps electoral watchers or people that are working in the field, because disinformation is not just a journalistic problem. And we are working separately without enforce one to the other. then that's some of the things that I have just for this first approach.
Great, thank you, Laura. That's excellent. Let me turn back to Ilona. I think on a related topic, and just to take up this issue of civic space. Ilona, your new book details the relationship between the Bolsonaro administration and the media and civil society, shows how populist authoritarian governments, use intimidation and censorship to erode some of the safeguards we associate with democracy. I think you use the term a liberal democracy as kind of the specter of what one scenario may be if we continue down this path, looking at some of the countries in Eastern Europe, perhaps as a warning sign. Can you talk us through sort of what the conclusions are of your book and how they relate to the broader issues that we're seeing in the region?
Sorry, I'm muted. So
and I'm just, as a reminder to myself as much as to all of you, if we could all speak slowly so that the interpreters aren't struggling to keep up.
Sure, just building on where we were speaking before on the institutional capacities and separation of powers. This is a traditional lens that we always try to see the health of a democracy, to analyze the health of a democracy. And what we felt in Brazil, and just looking at these countries that we've been pinpointing here that are ran today by populist authoritarian leaders, is that there's a whole other part of the society which we call the civic space. This it's like public sphere between governments, business, and family, where citizens organize dialogue, debate, but also try to influence public policy and the political systems of their countries. This has been, I think, one of the first, I would say, spaces under attack in any of the countries that saw the rise of populist authoritarian. And because institutions are not so strong or don't have the capacity to fight, let's say, the encroachment of the state upon its freedoms, and again, because of the time that it takes to build material cases and also to be able to prosecute facts against the actors in the civic space, we've been almost, I'd say, orphans of support, institutional support, to keep doing our work. So we are, as organizations, having to count many times in countries like Brazil with international partners that understand better what's going on than actually the Brazilian society. So since this happened in Brazil very fast, we decided at the Garapé Institute that we should really study what was going on in Brazil, monitor, and based also on interviews and the experience of other countries. So we just launched a typology called, there's a publication called The Agora is Under Attack that makes the case for the strategies, the methods used by these kinds of governments to, first to, shut up any kind of opposition, plural or tolerant debate in society, since these leaders have this trait of having like their own truth and the only possible narrative about the way they want to go. So journalists, artists, civil society leaders, academics, scientists are under extreme, I would say, strategies and a lot of pressure when they are out there in the public debate. And we see the digital sphere, but it's not only there. I think it starts with this dehumanization, defamation, trying to, what they call literally to destroy people's, not only ideas, they want to destroy the reputation and the capacity of people and institutions to do that. And what really struck us in Brazil is that the speed of this closure of civic space. So right in the beginning of the government in 2019, there was an intent to coordinate civil society work. At that moment, we pushed back and there was no formal decree to do that. But again, 2 weeks ago, this conversation goes back in relation to the environmental organizations. But right after, dozens of public policy councils, which are participatory, voluntary, that were being built since the democratization in Brazil, were shut down. So we lost, and I can say, I've been working in civil society for 20 years. Regardless of who was in power, regardless of who are the ministers, we always had the opportunity to dialogue, to sit down at the table. And honestly, in the key areas that we were mentioning, they're gone. So there's no space at the table anymore. There's an intent also to make much harder the access to public information. A lot of documents being classified, intent to change a law that we have, which allows for transparency in public data. So this is all being tried. Still, some of this is not happening in the formal ways, but then you classify more documents for no apparent reason, or you, revoke decrees that allowed for specific collaborations, and you also taint that you cannot have dialogue with people that think differently. So there's a lot of self-censorship in all sides of this interaction with the federal government today. And of course, in terms of consequences, direct consequences there, you see the lack of transparency. So of course, the capacity of civil society, the press, and others to see what's going on, to pressure for evidence-based, informed public policy, to monitor actually what is being implemented or not, and of course the results. And in Brazil, we've been with many, I would say, effort of many, working until 2018 with different styles, but we were allowed, the civil society, to participate in the design, monitoring, sometimes even implementation of public policy. So we had a good idea of what was, going right, going wrong, what had to change, and it was challenging dialogue, but it happened. Now, honestly, at the federal level, and this has repercussions in state levels and municipal levels as well, this place is not there. The only people that have access are of the people that are supporting the government, or some business associations that are also, I'd say it's a more, it's not a public interest debate many times. It's more, legitimate many times, but it's just not linked to the public interest that we are trying always to make the government accountable. So we are also seeing, because of the lack of freedom, academic freedom, and so on, there were lists being made by the Minister of Justice of non-aligned aligned police or academics in Brazil, what they call the anti-fascist academics or police. So there was also using state apparatus to monitor who are these people, and to do what then is the big question. We're seeing more and more members of criminal justice and public security institutions using formal legal instruments illegitimately to also I would say intimidate journalists, opinion makers, or for example influencers and civil society leaders. And there are examples that run from prosecutors to police chiefs, from civil police to federal police. So it's kind of I can't say it's the institution as a whole, but because of the instruments that are there, they're members of this institution, subverting the use of legal instruments to intimidate, and of course to take those people out of debate. We're seeing orchestration of processes against some of these characters. So of course, I can say, just given the COVID example that we're talking here, what happens is that we have the second number of, in terms of, we're the second in death by COVID in the world. We're seeing a lot of people leaving our academics, the brain drain in Brazil, and this is happening and being noticed by academic institutions worldwide. We're being again, Brazil has lost the label of a liberal democracy. We're now called the electoral democracy by some of the think tanks that monitor democracies. So this is all happening. And as we were talking about, the institutions are holding. Well, there's this other sphere here that is not protected yet. So we're calling them to help us push back also on this, while also holding strong that institutions can reinforce their mandate and not give so much space to I would say, unfortunately, the members of these institutions that are trying to follow the ideological and more authoritarian rule.
Terrific. Thank you, Ilona. I want to pick up exactly where you left off and turn back to Arturo Valenzuela. Arturo, I think you very correctly kind of gave us the long view of history on some of these questions and pointed out that, relative to earlier periods, military coups, for example, have become very rare in Latin America, and that's certainly something to celebrate. At the same time, what we're hearing from Ilona is, I think she said, the shocking speed at which Civic Space closed in Brazil, which obviously provokes kind of a reflection on, the solidity of the democratic institutions that were built among during more liberal-minded governments, and what that may mean for the prospects of democracy, if not, democracy versus authoritarianism, but at least, liberal democracy versus illiberal or simply electoral democracy. So that would be my first question. If you could just sort of react to that, and then a second question, if I can cheat and put two on your desk, has to do with U.S. policy. Obviously, you've been in the position of advising presidents at the White House, of leading U.S. diplomacy in the hemisphere from the State Department. We have a president-elect taking office next month who has made the defense of democracy and combating rising authoritarianism in the world a real pillar of his worldview and his foreign policy. If you were in a position to advise President-elect Biden on how to carry forward that agenda in Latin America in this somewhat challenging landscape, in a moment where U.S. democracy also has a lot certainly to reflect on and rebuild from, what would you advise President Biden if he were to think about how to carry forward a democracy-focused agenda in Latin America?
Well, thanks, Michael, very much, and I appreciate the exchanges in this discussion. And I will try to speak a little bit more slowly in English now to help our translators on this. Yes, with regard to the first set of questions, which really has to do with what's happened really with the perception of representative government and civil society. Unfortunately, in situations where you had in Brazil comes to mind very strongly compared with some countries where it's happened as well, but not to the same level as Chile or Uruguay and so on and so forth, a situation where you had a long sort of tradition of somewhat corrupt politics, maybe the way in which presidents in Brazil had to overcome the issue of what do they do with the fact that they don't really command significant majorities in the Congress itself. The parties were fragmented, they were fairly weak, but at the same time, individual parties would exact a price. So you got this, perverse sort of system where what you wanted to do in order to get support and so on and so forth, you would then insist on some kind of a payback scheme to work out. And I think Ilona kind of referred to this at one particular point, when essentially the authoritarian leader is now doing the same sort of thing. Well, how do I bring some parties onto my side? Well, let's make some deals right here. And so you get this whole notion of, by the way, I'm not generally necessarily a critic of log rolling and not necessarily a critic of earmarks and that kind of thing that go into budget laws and things like that. I think that there's a place for that sort of thing, but we really need to have the politics being transparent. You need to have open parliaments with a lot of transparency. You need to have transparency in all these sorts of exchanges and deals that are taking place. I think that's quite important. In other words, and essentially to underscore the fundamental issue here is we have to strengthen political parties. We haven't really mentioned the word political parties. too much in our discussion this morning, but political parties are the essential sort of transmission belt of the will of the people towards the decision-making process. And then if you look at the Federalist Papers, there was some skepticism of factions and so on and so forth, but even Madison himself was able to say later on, the parties are fundamental. So we need to have parties. They need to be democratically transparent internally. There has to be internal democracy as well that needs to be sort of supported and so on and so forth. But essentially, we need to sort of create, balance in a sense of this business and provide for a civic society, that is sound as well. And instead of thinking that what you have is a conflict between civil society on the one hand and civic society on the other, let's make sure that representative governance means melding the two. And then let me just, on this point, just finish real quickly of saying, one of the worst things that's happened is that we can no longer sort of think about how civil society represents, an attempt to bring about, better democratization. Look what's happened thanks to what? The thing that allowed perhaps civil society to become, far more empowered was social media. And yet today we're seeing how social media became incredibly perverse. In fact, the opposite has happened. Social media has contributed to, in fact, fragmenting even further civil society. And not only that, but sponsoring all sorts of hateful activities and so on and so forth that are going on. I think everybody ought to watch the movies, The Social Dilemma, because it just shows how, in fact, the racism and all that kind of thing that we see in the United States is being spawned by this sort of thing. So you get a fragmentation, but not only you get hatred, you get all kinds of manipulations and things like that we need to be careful for. Well, I'll finish with that and just simply go on to the second point, which is, yes, there has to be a focus on the part of the United States towards a relationship with Latin America as a whole, not simply just focused in a rather obsessive way with not that that's not important, these issues, the Cuba, Venezuela dimensions and so on and so forth. But in fact, there has to be sort of a return to two things. One, a multilateral approach to working together with governments to try to support various different kinds of attempts through institutions. And this is where you value the international institutions as well, including the international institutions like the UN and the World the Health Organization, the World Commerce Organizations, and so on and so forth, climate change, those sorts of things. Why do I mention them? Because they have a significant impact as well as in Latin America. So people who say, "Oh well, you're not answering my question. You're not talking about what is important for Latin America," and then to get back also to strengthen the regional organizations and to go back to some of the values that the United States always worked on, which are, to try to, unfortunately, we're no longer the shining city on the hill. I don't think we ever really were that shining to be, but if the United States is really going to take leadership on things like promoting democratic values and that kind of thing, to go back to the phrases that and I think that we did move in that direction with the end of the Cold War. Prior to the end of the Cold War, we had a different mentality. It was just, how do you sort of beat the Soviets at this sort of game? And that meant the United States countenanced all sorts of things that were really quite damaging to democratic institutions generally. But after the end of the Cold War, we moved in another direction. It's important to recover that, to come back to that, to sort of say, we're going to work together. We have our own problems in our own country. Maybe you can help us also to think about the kinds of things that we need to do. What we all have the same sort of effort to try to make sure the government by the people, for the people, and of the people really should not end from the face of the earth, to sort of quote Lincoln.
Well said, Arturo. Laura, let me turn back to you. Arturo raised social media companies and their role in democracy in contemporary times. Just to kind of set up the question for you, former President Obama has been in the news a little bit lately talking about this issue. He actually called the internet and social media the single biggest threat to our democracy. And his argument is that if we can't tell what's true and what's false, the marketplace of ideas essentially breaks down. And by definition, democracy doesn't work. We have seen, both in the context of the pandemic and in the context of the US election, social media companies under a lot of scrutiny and actually responding, taking more aggressive measures in the face of disinformation, labeling false information, in some cases even taking down false information, as well as kind of promoting verified information, for example, from public health authorities in the context of the pandemic. So I wonder if you could maybe give us your reflections on what President Obama had to say, kind of broadly about social media and democracy, and more specifically on whether we're seeing companies take more effective measures to assume in a more kind of proactive and responsible way their role in the democratic debate.
Yeah, I think we can see a clear change in the position of the platforms if we look to some years ago, where they try not to be involved with the discussion, and they said, we are not a media, we are not moderating, we are not part of the discussion, we are just facilitating family and friends conversations. And say the situation today that the platform assume they have a role in all these problems, it is a good thing. The biggest problem that we have is, and perhaps this new role they assume can be possible. I'm not saying necessarily it's gonna be, but it can be possible. The problem that we'd always have is that they has not always been transparent at all with the criteria they use to take their actions. And the other thing that I think is problematic for Argentina and Latin America and also other continents outside Europe and the States is that the criteria they are applying are different in different countries. And then that add a new problematic situation, because in the past they used to say we have a global policy that we apply. And we saw during the pandemic and during the US election that they are not necessarily taking the same measures with Trump and with Bolsonaro in almost the same message from the presidents. And I believe this is obvious a big problem, because if it's not transparent, that could generate more trust problems, not only on their companies, that I don't necessarily care about that, but also it can be a big problem for fact checkers or media that are working on their platforms to have, or we are working with them to have our content reaching the people that are also consuming this information. Then I think one of the most important policies that the International Fact-Checking Network that Chequeado is part of are trying to take is we are pushing in all the ways we can Facebook, Twitter, Google, and the rest of the platforms, insisting them that they should be more transparent. Their policies should be open. Their policies should be transparent. I'm not saying if they are going to be good or bad policies. I'm in the step asking them, we need to know, and we have the right to know what your policies and the way you are applying the policies. That related to the platforms and related to the choices is we know and we believe that there are choices made when algorithms are developed and I think we need also much more research and data for people that are not necessarily involved in the tech discussion or the media discussion, because the civil debate and the civic space that Yona talked about is happening in part in that places, and the people are not always care about the way that conversation are taking space. Why you show me this, or why I'm discussing today this issue without knowing why you are showing me this content and not other. But in the discussion, at least in my point of view, when we point or we point out the companies or the tech companies, in some cases, at least what we related to the quality of the public debate is a lot of the problems we see in social network are linked to the traditional actors. I said for the actors that we always point out in the past. And that actors are in some cases presidents or publications, some cases they are media or traditional media that are also being part of some cases propaganda campaigns or not being transparent related to their editorial position. What I'm saying and adding just I can find the word is complejidad, more complex, just help me.
Complexity
in our environment in Latin America is that on the opposite of what happened in the States, where in general the media have a transparent policy related to the candidates. In our countries, that is not in that way. And then there are a lot of problems with point out the problem of disinformation, just like a problem of the social media or the algorithmic, without pointing out also to the traditional actors that are being part of these type of campaigns or these debates without evidence, using the non-transparent scenario of the social media. And what I'm saying is that when we started Kiado, we fact-checking leaders and media with the name. We know the people we are pointing out to said, what you said is false or is exaggerated or biased. What happened today is that leaders that contribute to give the citizens bad information or not at all data about their public policies, they are using their platforms, not necessarily in all the cases given their name or their face, and saying it's a platform or a Facebook problem. And what I'm saying is that for sure it's a technology problem, but a technology problem that in some cases the traditional leaders use pretty well. And then we have not to lose that part of the problem that we continue having. More transparent for the techies, also more transparent for the traditional media and for the public leaders.
Very clear. Gracias. Thank you, Laura. That's excellent. I want to actually pick up on some of those themes. We're receiving some great questions from our audience. So Felipe, I'm going to pose maybe a couple of them to you. The first has to do with some of the issues that Laura was mentioning, having to do with information silos, echo chambers, and political polarization, how these things relate to each other, and what if anything a remedy may be for those challenges, which obviously relate to the broader questions about democratic prospects in Latin America and everywhere, really. And the second question has to do with your, I think, quite troubling finding about youth attitudes towards democracy. And again, there, what can government or civil society hope to do, in response to that? I don't think we want to go through another round of military coups and dictatorships in order for people to have to appreciate the importance of democracy again. So if the conclusion that lived experience was what led older generations to value democracy, how do we kind of recreate that among a younger generation that I think, as you said, didn't live through the authoritarian period and has seen at best kind of mixed results in practical terms from the democratic governments that they have lived through. So two easy questions for you to take on.
Yeah, you're asking me questions that are quite complex, and I think on the first one, to complement what Laura was saying, it's become abundantly clear that Latin American democracy has a technology problem. And that technology problem is not just pertaining to social media. Social media is certainly a key component of it, but it extends beyond social media. What I mean by that is that for a long time, and I used to work on collaborative governance approaches that sought to use technology to better the relationship between citizens and governments. For a long time, we thought that technology would have a positive effect on making sure that, for example, the provision of public services was done in a more effective manner, that citizens and government could actually speak to one another and share information in ways that would make society smarter, that you could crowdsource solutions to policy problems. And while technology does have all of those potentials, and while in Latin America it has been used for those purposes, for example, in Brazil, for participatory budgeting sessions that also incorporate mobile and SMS technology, it is clear that there are also a number of other issues with technology, particularly if it exacerbates the asymmetry of power between those in government and the citizens. And what we see, for example, in Mexico, where the government has used technology to illegally surveil political opponents, journalists, and social activists, or as we hear about in my own country, Colombia, as the government was using aid from the United States and military cooperation and intelligence cooperation from the United States to surveil journalists and social movement leaders in a country where that is the top country in the world on killings on social movement leaders. I think it shows that it is very concerning, and that we need to keep in mind how we will apply technology to actually minimize the asymmetry of power between citizens and government and not further exacerbate it. But what Laura is saying about social media is completely true. The reality of the matter is that Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp have paid less attention to Latin America than they have to other regions where they've been criticized more publicly for their inability to curtail disinformation, particularly as it comes from political leaders. Yes, it is true that they took down a set of networks associated with the Brazilian president, what in Brazil folks often call the hate cabinet, but that is just one small action in the context of a much broader problem in which, as Laura was saying, we don't really have transparency about how social media companies are regulating political speech, political advertisement online. And Latin America do a reckoning on those areas. And I think it is imperative that folks out there who are working in these topics build an evidence base of how information is moving in those networks, to be able to engage with Facebook in a conversation about how policies that they've applied in other countries, like what they just did in the US election, should also be applied in the context of Latin America, but with a very careful eye to not actually hindering freedom of speech. Because the response of some authoritarian leaders as a result of cries about disinformation spreading online is to actually try to do regulations or to set up committees that will monitor social media. So in Argentina, we're hearing about these kind of social media police that the government is putting in place. And we're hearing about comedians going to jail because they posted a joke on social media. It is imperative that we show that freedom of expression and regulation of disinformation online are not mutually exclusive, because they're not in any way. And I think that social media companies have a responsibility to come into that conversation in Latin American circles with clear proposals and with an openness to hear from civil society about how they will do better than they've done thus far. And then on your point on youth, and I'll be very brief on this because I know that we want to allow more time for other questions, but on your point on youth, I think that what the pandemic has shown us in Latin America and elsewhere is that the current version of democracy that has mostly been centered around the kinds of saviors that Arturo was referencing, and that has been centered around economic models that have promoted inequality, at the very least in Latin America, are failing us. And what we need to do, and what the pandemic truly requires, is a broad reimagining of democracy. And to reimagine democracy, we need to actually engage youth into a conversation in which they think not about how they would replace democracy, but how they can actually build the kind of democracy that they deserve. And youth are doing that across Latin America in many places. We saw the protest in Brazil when the vice president said that racism didn't exist in the country, or the protest in Colombia when police brutally killed innocent people in the past months, or the way in which in Chile, citizens have successfully advocated for a constitutional reform. So there is potential there, but we have to make sure that we use narrative models and opportunities for engagement for youth that show them that the path that we need to follow is the one of reimagining a better democracy, not discarding democracy altogether.
Just adding there, a democracy that includes them and give them voices, because we are making a project that is called Activamente, focuses on youngs and pandemic and what happened with them, with groups of WhatsApp with 1,000 youth in Colombia, Ecuador, and Argentina talking with us. And what they said is that we didn't have policies for us. We didn't have media that include us. They need a democracy that include them as main actors, not just politics or policies that include them when they are, I don't know, a big problem related to them. And I think that's a challenge, also a big challenge for organizations like Together. How can we work with them to be a better source for them?
Terrific. Thank you both. That was a really great exchange. We have a lot of good questions and more than I'm going to have time to ask. But in the 10 minutes or so that we have left, I want to just turn back to Arturo and Ilona and maybe ask two versions of the same question that we received from one of our audience members, and it's about the democracy summit that President-elect Biden has promised. As we again kind of cast our eyes towards 2021 and hopefully gradually emerging from the pandemic, and certainly with a transition here in Washington. One of the major commitments that President-elect Biden has made is to host a summit of democracies as kind of a signature event in his ambition to restore democracy promotion as a pillar of U.S. foreign policy. And so the question for Arturo, I think, is a broad one. What do you think, Arturo, of this idea? How can it be kind of most effective? And for Ilona, maybe a more specific question, which is how could this summit be best utilized to protect and recover a civic space in a country like Brazil? And maybe an even more tricky question, which is, should Brazil be invited? Should Brazil be at the table in a global democracy summit, given some of the realities and trends that you've discussed? So I'll let you chew on that while we turn first to Arturo. Appreciate if you can both, again, be fairly succinct in your answers and speak slowly for the interpreters.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Michael. What I would like to add to this is actually, I think that it's good that Biden is talking in these terms, right? You know, I mean, we didn't hear anything about this in the previous administration or the administration that's still here, but it's going to be previous soon, hopefully. And quite the contrary, we saw an administration that was perfectly happy to embrace authoritarians in other places of the world and to adulate them and so on and so forth, to send messages that were confusing in terms of democracy promotion and so on and so forth. When in fact there's been a long period of sort of dialogue between institutions supported in the United States, such as those, for example, of the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, the people who worked on election reform and all that kind of stuff, and people working on open parliaments and so on and so forth. So to give the green light to folks like that, to begin to fund again agencies that were cut back when it came to that kind of support on the part of the United States. The USA Agency for International Development saw significant cutbacks there as well. Now, this is not the United States kind of bringing US ideas, because we need to be consumers as well in the United States, given the really significant problems that we've had with democracy. This is a dialogue where we see how like-minded people in Latin America, in the United States, can sort of say, well, how do we help us improve our democracy? What can we learn from maybe things that you have tried? Certainly, we need to work on our electoral system. We need to work on many, many, many different sorts of things. Just even simple things like, voluntary versus required voting, obligatory voting. There are a lot of people who've said obligatory voting is actually good for democratic institutions and so on and so forth. So I think that what you'd have to do is take the very different components of representative government. How do we strengthen political parties but make sure that they're democratically internally? How do we work to try to make sure that parliaments are more open and transparent, and how they can, in fact, strengthen themselves? How do civil society organizations, how can they have a more effective dialogue with these sorts of organizations, which means maybe not plebiscites, but hearings, open hearings in parliaments and so on and so forth. And so I think that that's useful. I think having this summits like this works. It really puts it on the table. And let me just end with one other thing that you didn't mention. This administration has also backed away from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In fact, the president has made clear that he doesn't accept the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Why he thinks that it's okay for companies to bribe officials in different parts of the world, I'm not going to get into that. But maybe he himself had some experience with that sort of thing. The president, that is. So that's another dimension. I was skeptical at one point of the extraterritoriality of U.S. policy, but the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the way it was implemented convinced me that this was a helpful thing. It helped in Brazil. It helped in other places like that. When FIFA was investigated, this, I had a lot of appreciation for people who worked in the Obama administration on these issues. In fact, I know many of them, some of them are close friends of ours. So we need to sort of look at all of these different dimensions, and let's not forget the issue of corruption and the issue of conflicts of interest and things like that as we look forward to trying to, So I appreciate the fact that we have to be back at the table, both in the United States and in Latin America, to be discussing these things. And a regional focus is a useful thing to do because we have so many interests in common. I won't go ahead. I'll stop right there, Michael, because we're running out of time. Thanks.
Thanks, Arturo. Thank you for. I know we could discuss these issues for another hour easily, but appreciate you raising corruption and FCPA. These are issues that we spent a lot of time kind of thinking about and analyzing. So glad you were able to mention that. Ilona, I'm going to give you the final word on this issue.
I think this is a key question, and I've been reflecting a lot about, for example, the role of the Biden administration vis-a-vis the protection of the Amazon, for instance. And it's, I would say, I tend to believe that there is an opportunity for re-engagement, and in that sense, you know, I'm very worried and following the erosion of democracy in Brazil. But I think the Biden administration has to give the benefit of the doubt and invite the government of Brazil. And I think a good balance would be also to invite people that are, you know, representations of civil society or business that are, I would say, working more than the government at this stage to promote the public good, the good, I would say, the commons in our region, in our world. So I would really appreciate seeing Brazil back at the table. And I think there is I'd say a way to nudge and incentivize because there's I would say the US has the carrots and has the sticks. So if not the US, who would try to re-engage Brazil in the democratic debate? So I'd be very interested to follow this and to see how how this would present. But at first, I would say yes, invite Brazil. Let's see what they come up, and invite representations that are actually doing the work that the government should be doing for our commons. And let's see how this plays out. With key to just as we move forward to observe that and to try to get this governments back at the table before it's too late. We still have 2 more years in Brazil of this government, which was democratically elected, with all the issues on social media and disinformation and so on. But here we are. So what can we do? Our best in terms of trying to fix what is not working together, because it's collaboration that we need and not more segregation. So I think building bridges and coalitions that involve all sectors of society. We need to hack polarization at this moment, and this means talking to those that we disagree and trying to just bring people back to the table.
Thank you, Ilona. I think that's a terrific note to end on. I think a good charge for all of us. Hacking polarization would, I think, be an apt motto, perhaps, for what we need in this country as well. So it's we don't mean by any means to suggest that some of these challenges are exclusive to Latin America, but it's been a really rewarding hour and a half looking at these issues in the region with you. I want to again thank Luminate, Felipe, for your partnership. Congratulations on this survey, which I think we've shared with everyone through the chat, but would really commend to folks for their consumption and reflection. I think there's a lot there to kind of think about as we continue to analyze and approach these issues. So thank you all again for joining me. I want to acknowledge the terrific research and logistical support of my colleague, Catherine Christie. And thank everyone for joining us. Stay well, stay safe, stay warm to those of us here in the north. Laura, enjoy the springtime in Buenos Aires, and we hope to collaborate again with all of you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.